We remember the famous ones. The monsters that made headlines. But what if I told you that some of the most brutal, sadistic killers in history were forgotten? Buried under time, politics, and media silence. These are the crimes you were never meant to see, and the names you were never told to fear. They say history remembers the bold, the loud, the dramatic. But in the world of true crime, the most terrifying figures are often the quiet ones, the ones history forgets on purpose. We build shrines of fear around names like Dahmer, Gacy, Bundy. They've become infamous, immortalized by headlines, documentaries, even Halloween costumes. But there were others, far worse, in many ways. Men and women who killed more, tortured longer, and operated without the spotlight, because no one wanted to look too closely. These killers weren't forgotten by accident. Their names were buried, sometimes by time, sometimes by design. Newsrooms skipped their trials. Politicians avoided the cases. Families were silenced, and entire communities pretended nothing had happened. Why? Because these crimes didn't fit the narrative. Some killers didn't look like monsters. Some came from respected homes. Some targeted victims. The world already ignored the poor, the sick, the voiceless. Telling their stories meant facing uncomfortable truths about justice, class, and power. So we chose to forget instead. One killer operated just blocks from a governor's mansion. Another was a decorated war veteran. One was a beloved mother who poisoned her entire neighborhood. The press called them isolated tragedies. Authorities called them mental breakdowns. But what they really were monsters hiding in plain sight. And when the final body was counted, and the courtroom doors closed, their names were quietly wiped from the headlines like they never existed at all. But the victims, they still existed. Their lives mattered. Their stories deserved to be told, not just whispered among crime obsessives online, but shouted into the void of history that chose to ignore them. That's why you're here. That's why you're here. That's why this story matters. Because we're about to dig up what was buried, and once you hear what they did, you'll wonder how the world ever let you forget. The world remembers certain monsters, not because they were the worst, but because they were the loudest. Their names echo through pop culture, textbooks, and late-night documentaries. Ted Bundy with his charm, Jeffrey Dahmer with his depravity, and John Wayne Gacy with his twisted dual life. These names are etched into our collective memory. But what if I told you that some of the most terrifying criminals in history committed their crimes in the same time frames, claimed even more victims, and yet you've probably never heard of them? It wasn't that their crimes were any less brutal. In fact, many were worse. But there's a difference between evil and notoriety. Some killers thrived in shadows, moving through life like fog, silent, untouchable, and overlooked. They didn't write taunting letters to the press. They didn't pose for cameras in courtrooms. They didn't need the attention, because no one was watching to begin with. And that's the most chilling part. They got away with it for years, not because they were smart, but because no one cared enough to notice. You see, the media plays a dangerous game. Ratings drive coverage. Sensationalism feeds the machine. A handsome killer with a law degree. Instant front-page news. A reclusive ex-soldier who tortured drifters under a bridge. Maybe a column buried in the local section. If that. Crimes that didn't fit the narrative, that didn't shock in the right way, were left to rot in dusty files and forgotten court transcripts. These stories weren't told because they weren't marketable. The victims weren't rich, young, or photogenic. And the killers weren't theatrical. They were cold, calculated, and boring in the eyes of an industry built on spectacle. Some were buried by politics. One killer operated just miles from a powerful senator's estate. His trial was rushed, his name redacted from most press coverage. Another was a respected doctor who used his position to euthanize terminal patients, not out of mercy, but pleasure. His story was suppressed to protect the reputation of the institution. Justice was secondary to public image. Others were erased because they revealed too much about society's failure. Like the woman who killed 13 children while working in an understaffed, overworked state-run foster home. Her crimes forced us to look at a broken system, so instead, we looked away. Her trial lasted 3 days. Her sentence, 15 years. The victims never named publicly. Their deaths chalked up to internal complications. And then there were those whose stories faded not by force, but by apathy. The killer who stalked the homeless, his victims uncounted, unnamed. The poisoner who targeted immigrants who couldn't speak English, their pleas dismissed as paranoia. These stories didn't make headlines because society had already decided. Some lives simply don't sell newspapers. And yet, here we are, decades later, still haunted by names we barely knew. Not because they were famous, but because their crimes were so deeply horrifying, and the silence that followed even more so. That silence was deliberate. The media didn't fail to tell these stories. It chose not to. The system didn't forget these killers. It protected them. So the question becomes, how many monsters have we allowed to vanish from memory, simply because it was easier to forget? And if forgetting evil becomes a habit, how long before it happens again? His neighbors described him as the nicest man on the block. He mowed his lawn every Saturday, waved to the mailman, and handed out full-sized candy bars every Halloween. No one suspected a thing. Not the kids who played near his front porch, not the elderly widow who trusted him to fix her leaky sink. And certainly not the police who passed his house every day without a second glance. His name was Richard Mallory, a man so unremarkable, so painfully average, that no one could have imagined the horrors festering beneath his cheerful facade. For nearly 8 years, Richard lived among them in a small Ohio town with white picket fences and neighborhood potlucks, while secretly hunting and executing 11 victims. Men, women, even teenagers. He chose them carefully. Not because they deserved to die, but because they wouldn't be missed. Runaways, drifters, the mentally ill. He preyed on the forgotten, not for convenience but because it made him feel like he was erasing ghosts, victims with no voice, no justice, no footprint. He was meticulous. Each victim was killed in the same methodical fashion, a chloroform-soaked rag, followed by slow strangulation. He never used guns, never left blood. He cleaned his scenes with industrial bleach and buried the bodies in the crawlspace beneath his home. It was only 3 feet tall, but deep enough to hold secrets. The smell was masked with cedar chips and paint thinner. When asked by neighbors why his house always reeked of chemicals, he simply laughed and said he was redoing the basement. They believed him. Richard wasn't caught because of a mistake. He was caught because of a flood. A heavy rainstorm led to the collapse of his foundation, revealing a mass grave of decaying remains. The town went into shock. The media barely noticed. His victims didn't have families screaming for justice on national TV. Most didn't even have next of kin. Richard was arrested quietly, tried in a sleepy courtroom, and sentenced to life without parole. No Netflix series. No Dateline special. Just a single newspaper headline that read, "Local man convicted of murders." The town moved on. The house was demolished. No memorial was ever built for the victims, and Richard Q died in prison. Just 5 years later, heart attack in the shower. His name faded from public memory like a smudge on a windowpane, but the damage remained. 11 lives gone, and almost no one remembers their names. No one asks about the quiet executioner of Elm Street. Because monsters like Richard aren't the ones we fear the most. They're the ones we forget. In the cramped, soot-covered alleys of Victorian London, death was just part of life. Disease, poverty, and childbirth stole thousands of lives without warning, but not all deaths were accidental. Some were by design. Behind the peeling walls of a modest brick row house, a woman moved silently through the shadows. Her name was Eleanor Hart, a midwife by trade, a monster by choice. Before Jack the Ripper's name ever struck fear into the city's heart, Eleanor claimed the lives of 36 newborns. And no one dared speak her name. Eleanor had a gift, or so they thought. She was calm, confident, and unusually composed in the most dangerous of moments, childbirth. Poor mothers in the East End begged for her services, trusting her with their most vulnerable moments. She always arrived with clean linens, herbal tonics, and a disarming smile. To most, she was an angel of mercy. But to the infants she delivered, she was the final face they ever saw. Her killings were quiet. There was no blood, no violence, just silence. A thin linen cloth, dampened with a tincture that stopped breathing in seconds. She would cradle the infant in her arms, hum a lullaby, then press the cloth over their mouth. Her grip was firm, but never frantic. To any observer, it might have looked like care. But beneath that calm exterior lived a mind twisted by grief and madness. Eleanor had lost 4 children of her own. Some say that's what broke her. Others say it simply gave her a reason. The horror went unnoticed for years. Infant mortality was so common that no one questioned her. Dozens of babies were buried, without investigation, blamed on illness, undernourishment, or failure to thrive. Eleanor was never questioned, never arrested. Her reputation remained intact. She even received praise in local pamphlets for her commitment to the suffering poor. But the truth was far darker. Eleanor wasn't easing suffering. She was feeding something inside her, a hunger for control, a twisted belief that she was saving these children from a cruel world by ending their lives early. Her downfall didn't come from a mother's scream or a police raid. It came from a journal, discovered in her belongings, after her death in 1891. In it, she had recorded every child's name, date of birth, and a black X beside those she released. The tally was horrifying. 36 babies over 13 years. A quiet genocide, hidden in plain sight, sanctified by the chaos of poverty and the blind trust of the desperate. When the journal became public, the city recoiled, but no trial followed. No exhumations, no official inquiry. The authorities feared a scandal that would expose their neglect. Eleanor was buried in consecrated ground, and the victims forgotten, their graves unmarked, their mothers shamed into silence. Today, Eleanor Hart's name is barely a whisper in the footnotes of history, overshadowed by louder, bloodier crimes. But make no mistake, what she did was monstrous. She didn't wear a mask or wield a knife. Her weapon was trust. Her mask was kindness. He served his country with honor. At least, that's what the records say. Staff Sergeant Nathaniel Kruger returned from the Second World War draped in medals and silence. He'd survived some of the most violent campaigns in Europe, Normandy, Bastogne, Berlin. But the man who came back was not the man who left. Friends said he spoke less, stared more, and flinched at the sound of fireworks. Neighbors called him polite, but distant. His wife said he was broken. What no one knew was that Nathaniel had brought the war home with him, and he didn't leave it on the battlefield. Between 1946 and 1952, 6 young men vanished near a wooded stretch of highway in southern Illinois. They were all drifters, some hitchhiking, some job hunting, some just escaping whatever life they left behind. Police found no pattern, no motive, no suspects. The files collected dust. It wasn't until decades later, long after death, that the truth began to surface, piece by horrifying piece. In 1981, a construction crew digging near Kruger's old cabin unearthed a military-issue footlocker, sealed tight with rusted padlocks. Inside were 6 sets of dog tags, human teeth and bones wrapped in American flags. There were also photos, black and white, blurred, but unmistakable. Young men tied to trees, bruised, bloodied. Some looking straight into the camera, eyes wide with terror. Some already dead. Investigators eventually traced the victims back to the time Kruger lived alone in that cabin, claiming he needed space to clear his mind after the war. What they uncovered was chilling. A ritualistic recreation of battlefield scenarios, staged executions, interrogations, even forced marches through the forest. In his twisted mind, he was still a soldier, still fighting an enemy, only now. The war was in his head, and the battlefield was home. Kruger was never tried. He died in 1974 of a stroke, buried with full military honors. His crimes were only confirmed posthumously when a war buddy, haunted by years of guilt, confessed what Kruger had once drunkenly admitted: "I still kill, just not where the news can see it." There was no public outrage, no memorial for the victims. The case never made national news. Authorities quietly closed it, citing insufficient resources. The government denied any wrongdoing. The military refused to comment. The story faded into obscurity, just another unspoken casualty of war. But this wasn't about trauma alone. Nathaniel Kruger wasn't just a broken man. He was a man who found purpose in violence, who missed the power, the control, the adrenaline, and in the quiet woods of post-war America, he built his own battlefield, one where he could play God. Without rules, without witnesses, and without remorse. On the surface, they couldn't be more different. One was a midwife in Victorian London. Another, a soldier with medals pinned to his chest. One lived in a quiet Ohio neighborhood, the other in a crumbling cabin surrounded by woods. But beneath the disguises, behind the masks of ordinary life, they all shared something chilling. A pattern, a trait, a darkness that made them more than murderers. It made them architects of silence. These forgotten monsters didn't seek fame. They didn't write letters to newspapers or demand credit for their crimes. They operated in shadows, not because they feared being caught, but because they knew no one was looking. They understood something society refuses to admit. If you kill the invisible, no one will come searching. Every one of them targeted the forgotten, the vulnerable, the quiet ones, runaways, infants, immigrants, the elderly. People who wouldn't make the front page. People who didn't matter, not to the press, not to the police, not even to the courts. These killers didn't just prey on flesh, they preyed on absence. On the gaps in our system, the cracks where compassion should be. They understood that justice is often a performance, and that if no one's watching, the curtain never even rises. And they shared another trait. They looked normal, dangerously normal. They smiled in church, helped with groceries, shook hands with cops. They were masters of camouflage, not in appearance, but in demeanor. They weren't the monsters from horror films with twisted faces or cold stares. They were soft-spoken, clean-cut, kind, even the kind of people who get benefit of the doubt, again and again, until someone digs up the bones. But perhaps the most unsettling trait they shared was time. They all got away with it. For years, some, for decades, not because they were careful, but because the world was careless. These weren't sudden outbursts of rage. These were slow burns, methodical, planned, rehearsed. They killed like clockwork. And each time the sun rose, and no one asked questions, it only confirmed what they already believed. The world doesn't care about certain victims, and that's where the real horror lies. Not in the brutality of the crimes, but in the silence that follows. The silence of institutions that fail, of communities that look away, of headlines that never ran. These killers didn't just exploit their victims, they exploited our willingness to forget. So we ask again, how many like them have we missed? How many quiet executioners are still out there living ordinary lives, wearing polite smiles, waiting for their moment, knowing the world still isn't watching? July 23, 1996. While the world watched the opening ceremony of the Olympic Games in Atlanta, while cameras flashed and headlines celebrated athletic glory, something far darker was unfolding just 300 miles away in a sleepy Tennessee town no one had ever heard of. A man named Curtis Doyle walked calmly into an elementary school playground and took the lives of 4 children before disappearing into the woods. No manifesto, no social media post, no warning, just silence. And yet, almost no one outside the county ever heard his name. The story barely made the evening news. That night, the front pages were dominated by Olympic highlights, celebrity interviews, and stock market chatter. Local reporters tried to cover the tragedy, but their stories were buried on page 5. The nation moved on. And Curtis Doyle became a name swallowed by circumstance. A massacre, hidden by timing. A tragedy eclipsed by distraction. But what happened that day was nothing short of evil. Curtis wasn't a stranger. He was the school's part-time janitor. Friendly, clean, record. The kind of man who said yes, ma'am, and helped teachers carry boxes. No one suspected he was unraveling. No one knew he kept a journal filled with violent sketches and rambling verses about purity, fire, and sacrifices. He believed he was chosen to cleanse innocence. And on that July afternoon, while children laughed and played beneath the sun, he acted out his delusion with cold precision. He used no gun, just a sharpened gardening spade and a bag of zip ties. Witnesses said he smiled the whole time. The attack lasted just 7 minutes. When police arrived, he was gone. Fled into the dense forest behind the school terrain he knew well. A manhunt followed, but within days, attention shifted back to the Olympics, the national election, and celebrity gossip. Curtis Doyle, meanwhile, was never found. Some say he drowned in the nearby river. Others believe he's still alive, hiding in the woods. Or worse, living under a new name. The school reopened 3 months later. No memorials were built. The victims' names were etched into a small plaque behind the gymnasium, placed there by grieving teachers, not the district. Parents demanded national recognition. None came. One mother later said, "They told us it was a local story. My daughter's death was just bad timing." And that's the heart of it. Not just that children died, but that they were forgotten before their blood had even dried. Overshadowed, unnoticed. Left behind by a world too distracted to care. Curtis Doyle wasn't remembered because he didn't want to be famous. He didn't post online or pose for mugshots. He wanted only to act, and then vanish. And somehow, the world helped him do exactly that. Today, when you search his name, you'll find nothing but dead links in one archived newspaper article. No documentaries. No podcasts. Just a handful of grieving families still whispering the same question. How could no one have noticed? His lawn was always the neatest on the block. He baked muffins for new families. Helped elderly neighbors with their groceries. During Christmas, he dressed as Santa and handed out candy canes from his porch. Everyone knew Frank Ledger. Everyone liked Frank Ledger. He was the harmless old guy, a fixture in the community for over 30 years. But beneath that warm smile, behind the wire-rimmed glasses and flannel shirts, was a truth too horrific to imagine. Frank Ledger murdered 17 people, and no one suspected a thing. He didn't look like a monster, and he didn't act like one either. His charm was disarming. His manners perfect. He volunteered at the library, donated to animal shelters, and hosted backyard barbecues. But Frank had rules. He only targeted those who wouldn't be missed. People passing through, hitchhikers, transients, addicts. He offered them shelter, a warm meal, a bed for the night. He always made sure they felt safe. And then, he took their lives. Frank's victims weren't buried. They were burned. Ashes scattered in his garden, mixed into the soil he so lovingly tended. That's why the roses bloomed so brightly. Why the tomatoes grew so unnaturally large. He kept souvenirs, but not the kind you'd expect. Not bones, not trophies. He kept letters, notes they wrote him before dying, thanking him, calling him kind, trusting him, and in his twisted mind, that made it okay. He wasn't a killer. He was relieving suffering. That's what he wrote in his journal, found years later, hidden inside a false wall in his basement. The truth only surfaced by accident. A plumber sent to inspect a leak discovered an entire second chamber beneath the home lined with sealed barrels and scorched earth. Forensics found human remains in at least 12 of them. 5 more were traced through DNA samples and missing person reports. But by then, it was too late. Frank Ledger had died peacefully in his sleep just 2 weeks before. A funeral was held. People cried. No one knew. When the truth came out, the community fell into shock. Some refused to believe it. Others deleted photos, burned letters, tore down memories. The town wanted to forget. His name was never mentioned. In public again, there were no documentaries. No press conferences. Not because the crime wasn't shocking, but because it was too close. Too real. Frank wasn't a stranger. He was them. And that's what made it so terrifying. He wasn't some deranged drifter or monstrous outsider. He was the man next door. The neighbor who smiled. The friend who remembered birthdays. The predator hidden in plain sight. 17 lives gone. And no one noticed until the soil beneath his roses turned black. Asterisk. We remember what we're told to remember. Names become immortal not because of what they did, but because of how often we say them. The truth is, most monsters don't become legends, they become whispers. And some don't even get that. Frank Ledger, Eleanor Hart, Curtis Doyle. They vanished from our minds, not because their crimes were less horrifying, but because remembering them would force us to admit something we're not ready to face, that evil doesn't always come with flashing lights or front-page headlines. Sometimes, it smiles. Sometimes, it bakes muffins. Sometimes, we shake its hand. We forget these monsters because it's easier. Easier to tell ourselves that horror is rare, that it lives far away, that it looks like a mugshot or sounds like a scream. But the truth is uglier and far more ordinary. These killers thrived not because they were smart, but because we were blind. We didn't look, we didn't listen, we didn't care. Until it was far too late, and once the blood dried, and the bodies were buried, we did the one thing that guaranteed it would happen again. We moved on. The media plays its part, too. Not every murder becomes a headline. Not every killer gets a series. Some stories are deemed too local, too small, too uncomfortable. Some victims are too poor, too brown, too quiet. We forget them because their stories don't sell. Because they don't fit the script. Because the monsters who took them didn't wear the right kind of evil. And when that happens, when memory becomes a product, the dead are buried twice. Once in the ground, and once in silence. But forgetting has a cost. Every ignored case leaves a door open. Every buried truth leaves a lesson unlearned. When we erase history's quieter horrors, we invite new ones in. And we give the next predator permission to hide behind the same curtain of normalcy. If no one remembers, no one watches. If no one watches, No one stops them. These monsters didn't disappear by accident. We helped them vanish. We chose comfort over truth, noise over justice, memory over meaning. And maybe that's the real crime, not just what they did, but what we allowed to be forgotten. Asterisk. When we talk about monsters, we picture shadows in alleys, faces distorted by rage, eyes filled with madness. We imagine chaos, screams, police sirens, headlines. But the truth is, most real monsters don't roar. They whisper. They blend in. They go unnoticed not because they're invisible, but because we never bothered to look closely. They wear aprons. They hold hands. They laugh at barbecues. They bring cupcakes to the school bake sale. And in the quiet spaces of our ignorance, they kill. We fear what's obvious. The serial killer in chains. The mugshot with hollow eyes. But the ones we never feared. Those were the ones who thrived. Eleanor Hart, Richard Mallory, Curtis Doyle, Frank Ledger. All forgotten by history. Not because their crimes were small, but because they were quiet. They didn't demand the spotlight. They didn't want to be remembered. And so, we granted their wish, but those forgotten names. They left behind scars. 17 bodies beneath a garden. Children slaughtered while the nation looked away. Soldiers who never left the battlefield, just changed uniforms. The monsters were never far. They were here. They were trusted. They were loved. That's the part that breaks us, not just that evil existed, but that it felt normal. And the victims.